evening and welcome to the Global Script. I'm Shafat Ali. Tonight we focus on Druze, a community about 700,000 strong, spread across Syria, Lebanon, Israel, and Israeli-occupied Golan Heights. Now standing at a crossroads. The map you're seeing shows a blue-marked zone known as the David Corridor, a strategic strip stretching from Soweida to El Tanaf. As of July 2025, with Syria in flux and regional fault lines deepening, the Druze story has entered a new chapter. We'll trace their journey from 1016 till present, explore their shifting alliances, their complex ties with Israel, their significance about this corridor, and their recent battles, especially in the July 2023. So this is the Global Script, and I'm Shafat Ali. So the Druze faith emerged in 1016 when Hamza ibn Ali founded a breakaway sect of the Ismaili Shia Imam in Fatimid era in Cairo. One that fused monotheism with Greek philosophy, but when extremist preacher Ad-Darazi distorted its teachings, internal rifts forced the faithful to flee to the anti-Lebanon mountains or the Levant area, whatever you want to call it. In particular, they were in the Mount Hermon and the surrounding areas. So now, historian Najla Abu Izzuddin, in her book The Druze, she says that the traced roots of the Druze community goes to the Arab tribes like the Tanukh, who claim, oddly supported by a 1930s French skull measurements, which sounds pretty odd, but that's how they claim their lineage to the Arabs. But it was their decision to ban conversions that preserved their identity. By 2024, the Druze population stood at 700,000. Now they're spread across Syria, 150,000, Lebanon, 200,000, Israel, 143,000, and Golan, 23,000. And according to the UN estimates, their long isolation has forged a deeply resilient community. But has that resilience prepared them for today's challenges? That's the question, because today the Druze are caught in a violent storm. In Syria, they make up just 3% of the population and mostly concentrated in the Soweida governorate, a region which borders Jordan and spanning over 505,000 square kilometers. But since the Syrian civil war in 2011, the Soweida has remained unstable. In March 2025, 47 were killed in Latakia. In April, 103 died in Soweida, but that's according to CNN. But independent resources say that more than 1,000 people died in March and April conflicts. In Golan Heights, the occupied territories by the Israel since 1967, the Druze population shrank from 20,000 to just 5,000 across 5 villages, including Majd al-Shams and Ghajr, which are technically the strongholds of the Druze population. Old land disputes with the Bedouin herders, some dating back to 19th century Ottoman land grants, they have just resurfaced with this, what should we call that? This sectarian rhetoric or whatever you want to call that. But since the Al-Shara has assumed the charge in Syria, these conflicts and these rhetorics, along with sectarian rhetorics, have resurfaced with nearly 50% of the eastern Syria, since it is now beyond government control. They all rose up, and they are the Bedouin population who are anti-Druze. So that makes Druze a chaotic landscape. Now the question here is that how secure can they be in a region where there's no boundary? Now, between 2000 and 2024, in fact, the Druze in Syria and the Golan, they've walked a fine line under the Bashar al-Assad. In the Golan, after the Israel annexed the area in 1981, 85% of Druze rejected Israeli citizenship, yet they still engaged in trade worth $12 million a year, especially with the Daraa region. And by 2019, which according to Israeli Bureau of Statistics, the volume is much more than that. Because in Soweida alone, there are local militias, especially the Jaish al-Mawahideen, which was formed in 2013 to resist the forced conscriptions. And in 2015, 150 Druze were killed in a single protest. By 2025, all these militias now control 60% of Sueda governorate. Now, when Assad fell in 2024, his successors, of course, when I say successors, that doesn't mean many people, but particularly Shara al-Jolani and his aides, they offered only one total ministerial seat to the Druze, which is held by Nazi al-Atrash. And their response is to build their own self-governance from their own ground up, which is obviously their necessity, and once again, it is now their strategy. Now, with all that, the Druze have an alliance with Israel. That began in 1956, when 3,000 Druze were conscripted into an IDF under what became known as the Brit Damim, the Blood Pact. And by 2023, 1,200 Druze are still serving in the IDF. Now, that creates more problem for the Druze community in the Arab region, because Israel takes Druze as their local faction among the Arabs, and to create more divide among the Arabs. Because in 1973, the politician Amal Nasser ad-Din, they founded the Zionist Druze Circle, and that boosted the integration a bit further. Because by 2024, Israel had 35,000 Druze citizens alone, which is roughly a quarter of its total Druze population. But in Golan, 5,000 still hold Syrian citizenship and remain wary. And online narratives claim that Israel backs Druze communities, and Israel is quite open about that as well, because Israel wants to use Druze to establish the so-called David Corridor, which is a buffer between Hezbollah and the Syria and the Israel. But does this alliance empower the Druze or entangle them? Well, stretching from Sueda to Al-Tanaf, the David Corridor, which is usually shown in the blue strip on the Syrian map. It's a 200 square kilometer security zone, which is established by Israel to connect 34 settlements and support 12,000 IDF groups. Since 2018, Israel has expanded this corridor, claiming that this is essential to protect the Golan from the Hezbollah infiltration. But this has also displaced 15% of Majd al-Shams farmland, and especially since 2020, these farmlands are totally in Israeli control. Now, according to the UN Resolution 497, which happened in 1981, this area of Golan is still considered as the occupied territory. Yet the corridor remains active. Is it safety net from Druze or a leash? We don't know yet. But in July 2025, a fight erupted between the Sueda's Druze and the Bedouin tribes over the scarce waters and grazing land and autonomy and the religious rhetoric, or whatever you want to call them, because there are many variables for this conflict. The violence left almost 248 dead. 60% of them were Druze. So the Men of Dignity militia, a Druze militia, which is 2,000 strong, responded with force, using RPGs and snipers to reclaim 70% of the contested territory. The backdrop, a 2023 drought that halved water reserves. 30 villages were damaged for the Druze. This wasn't just about land. It was about survival and the price the Druze are paying for it. It's about their survival and survival alone. Now, Druze are celebrating because they have so far, as they claim, defeated Jolani. And in May 2025, Hayat al-Tahrir al-Sham, which is the HTS, which is led by Abu Muhammad al-Jolani himself, they launched a major offensive on Sueda with 3,000 fighters. In fact, the internet claims more than 15,000 fighters. And they wanted to impose Sharia rule on the Druze community in the Sueda land. But Druze militias, they responded back with barely 1,500 militias, barely 1,500 strong, and they repelled and resisted these attacks for 12 consecutive days, killing more than 600 of the HTS militias. But the independent sources have been claiming that the number is no more than 137 HTS militias. Now, Israeli newspaper Yediot Achronot has been reporting that unconfirmed reports claim that Israeli drone support was used during the battle. And that cost was high because 89 civilians also lost their lives. Still, it's a rare victory, it's tactical discipline, it's local knowledge, and maybe it's help from the outside that has turned the tide. But has the conflict really ended? Or the Druze community is on the verge of another humanitarian disaster? Well, joining me now from Morocco is Ranim Ahmed, the communication director at the Syria campaign. And she has a keen eye over the issue. Ranim, welcome to the show. Ranim, the first thing we all want to know about this whole Druze saga is this about control? Is it about a land dispute? Is it about resources? Is it about a corridor? What's actually going on over there?
For having me, and if you have 5 hours, I can start to explain to you. It's a very complex or complicated situation, but from a human rights perspective, I can I can see, or I can say that since the interim authorities took over and appointed itself as the government that wants to rule Syria, they have failed over and over time to have this inclusive national dialogue where they include women and people from all of the communities and different backgrounds and religions in Syria, because Syria is a very diverse country, and you can't just control a diverse country with one color government. And sadly, the interim authorities didn't learn from their own failures and mistakes. We've seen how their politics led to rising sectarian rhetoric. We are seeing online and offline attacks on people because of their sect. This attacks rised a lot during March in the coastal region, when more than thousands of people were killed based on sectarian intentions. And it was proved by international and national reports and investigations that people who are affiliated with the government, factions affiliated with the government, are involved in those massacres. And because the government failed to hold those responsible to account and to fight this impunity and to end this sectarian rhetoric, we are seeing another wave of violence. We have seen it in Sweden today, and it's so heartbreaking to see that this could have been avoided. But I feel like the interim authorities are just being arrogant and ignorant. They don't want to admit to their failures. They don't want to uphold justice and accountability in the new Syria. And if they don't do that, the violence will continue to escalate. And we are really, like, we have been raising the alarm that Syria is now on the brink of a civil war. And it could be avoided if there are political will to resort to this political solution instead of a military solution.
There has been, when you talk about civil war, there are many definitions of civil war in Syria now, because in the past, since 2011, we have seen a civil war which had so many international powers in it. But this time we are talking about a war which is probably within the Syrian ranks itself. But coming on to the Druze, you talked about the sectarian rhetoric of the al-Sharaa regime. Do you think that this is going to change the Druze posture? I mean, we have seen them being autonomous for the past many years. They have been, totally neutral with the Assad regime. But do you think that with all this rhetoric, the Druze are going to change their posture into a more militarized version?
To be honest, I'm not sure. I'm not a military expert, but what I can say is that many of the Druze community, like any other community in Syria, joined the revolution since 2011 and called for reforms and called for Assad to step down and called for the values of the revolution, which is freedom, dignity, justice, accountability. And even before the fall of Assad, we have seen and we have been watching the beautiful protest, peaceful protest of the people of Sweden, calling for freedom, to free all of the detainees, against the Israeli aggression, all of the beautiful values that they upheld, all of these, like in the past months and years. And it's just sad because I know that after what the government did, like they resorted to this military solution by raiding Al Sueda or attacking Sueda, where a lot of the crimes were committed in the span of 48 hours, killings on the spot because of their sect, looting, raping, burning of homes, and forcing people out of their homes. We cannot expect that the residents of Sweden will trust this government again unless there's a real political solution and not a military one. That's what I see, and that's what I believe.
But that's not the situation on ground actually is, because we see that the Druze militia, they now control 70% of Sweden, and within the Druze population they are 700,000 strong, and they are divided in Israel and Lebanon and Syria. There are different opinions. There are people who talk about the, just like you said, the freedom. There are people who talk about being completely non-partisan. There are people who talk about the self-rule. They talk about self-governance. So, do you think that these rhetorics or these political stances, do they play a part in that in this political scenario as well, in this military scenario as well?
Of course, yes, like in any area where there are multiple armed groups, of course, the military situation will continue to raise like that. Um, as I said, I'm not a military expert, but I am sure that any armed group today in Sweden cannot represent the whole residents of Sweden or the whole Druze community. Even if they had their own agendas, it is the responsibility of the government, because it is the recognized government today by the international community. I can't speak on behalf of an armed group or a militia, but what I know is that the government in Damascus, because it is recognized by um, world leaders and a lot of international governments, they have the responsibility to try all of the past to like negotiate and push for a political solution or agreement instead of just resorting to this military solution.
We don't see a political solution anywhere close, but the situation right now that we just recently witnessed storms of Bedouin tribes trying to close in and encircle the Druze populations and Druze communities and Druze villages. Do you think that we can also witness another humanitarian crisis, just like we are witnessing in Gaza, for the Druze community who are trapped in Syria, especially in Sueda region?
Sadly, the humanitarian situation is bad today in Sweden. Of course, I'm not going to compare it with Gaza. Gaza has been under siege for long months. But in Sweden, we know that since the military um, operation started against Sweden, the communications has been cut, electricity and water also were cut, and all of the roads in or out of Sweden were cut by checkpoints, and thus making the residents of Sweden besieged. And today we speak with our partners and our friends on the ground who are activists and trying to help their communities in Sweden. They are telling us how bad the situation is and how heartbreaking that now people are still trying to look for their missing loved ones. They're trying to identify the bodies or find a place to bury them. They're just waking up to this like unimaginable horror that they suffered in the past days, and where families, entire families were shot dead. At least two doctors that we know of were shot while on their way to the hospital to help the injured, were shot by snipers. We know that we've seen a lot of videos, and of course, there was a peak of disinformation and misinformation circulating on social media, but we were able to confirm with our partners who are fact checkers at least two videos. One of them where what is believed to be armed men affiliated with the government asking three Druze men to jump from the window from the fourth stair and shooting them dead. Another video was circulated yesterday, and it dates back to last week, of a man, a terrified man, lying on the ground, and the armed men, also wearing the military uniform that is believed to be affiliated with the Syrian army. Uh, the armed men were asking this terrified man, "What are you?" And he said, "I'm Syrian." And the armed man answered, saying, "What is Syrian? Tell me, are you Muslim or Druze?" And he said, "Brother, I'm Druze." And he shot him dead. It was the most horrific video I've watched in so long. And it just tells that there is this ideological root to the problem that the interim authorities must look at and solve before it's too late, just to ensure that those killings are not repeated elsewhere, and to hold the perpetrators accountable and to admit that they failed to protect civilians. Today, it's their responsibility.
Absolutely agreed. When there is no dialogue, there is no solution. The military solution can never help. It has never helped since 2011. But we have seen something that throughout this Druze conflict, the international community had a deafening silence. Nobody said anything for the Druze except for the Israelis. Israelis were the one who spoke for the Druze, and that somehow has created more problem for the Druze overall. Do you think that in future more international players need to jump into this situation and control the Syrian al-Sharaa regime right now? Otherwise, the situation is going to get worse. Don't you agree with it?
Of course, yeah, I totally agree that the international community must live up to its responsibility. They claim that they want to uphold human rights around the globe, but not only the Druze community, they have failed all of the people of Syria in the past years. Like the Assad continued to commit crimes and to kill people under torture and to detain people and disappear them and then bury them in mass graves, while the international community knew that this was happening and did nothing to stop Assad. And now we are seeing more crimes being committed against the Syrian people, regardless of their sect. I'm not only talking about Druze. I know the Bedouin communities as well suffered of violations in the past days. I know people also from the Alawite community suffered from violations and horrific crimes in March. But it is something that is happening on all of the Syrian people. And now the international community, including the UN, must do something and not just stand silent and issue a shameful, we don't want statements. We're tired and sick of statements. What we need is action. What we need is real political solution and real political transition to save what's left of Syria. Syria is now devastated after the rule of Assad.
When you say that you want action, what specifically do you think that the international community or the UN has to do? What specifically are you pointing at?
Of course, I don't mean any military action. I don't support any military action today by anyone, any party. But what I mean by action or finding solutions, it's not my job to find solution, to suggest the solutions. They are the experts. The UN must know what to do. If they don't know what to do, then they have failed their work. It's not my job to offer them the solutions. But what I see as a human rights defender, I always believe that political transition, national dialogues and conversations and inclusion are good first steps to build a country. You can't today expect to have a civil peace in a diverse country like Syria without women sitting on the table. Today, I open social media, I check all of the official pages of the new interim authorities, and all I see are pictures of all men. Where are the women? Did they disappear, the Syrian women who did everything and who carried the heavy burden of calling for freedom and working and supporting their communities in all of those years, and now they are being excluded? How are we supposed to achieve civil peace and achieve justice if half of the community is not there?
Absolutely agreed. And beautifully put, Rani. Thank you so much for joining us.